the federal government has proposed this legislation that would mandate that internet service providers, or ISPs, would block all websites that are refused classification content in Australia. So at the moment, we actually have these laws that websites that are hosted in Australia, Australian websites, can actually be blocked. And how that works is that the ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, if they are alerted to a website that's hosted in Australia that contains content that may be refused classification, I'll just go through that definition. The definition here, you can see, includes child sexual abuse, imagery, bestiality, sexual violence, detailed instruction in crime, violence or drug use, and or material that advocates a terrorist act. So the important part for our purposes is detailed instruction in drug use can indeed result in a refused classification publication. And of course, originally this referred to books and then film and then video games, and now web content is also understood in this way. Of course, with web content, you can host the website overseas. So at the moment, you would not have such a problem with being blocked. So what they want to do is be able to make that possible for all websites, including websites that are hosted overseas. Okay, so refused classification has been used to censor drug-related publications in the past. Here are a couple of book covers you might be familiar with. The Phenylethylamines I Have Known and Loved from the Shulgins, and E for Ecstasy from Nick Saunders. And both of these books in the 1990s were actually banned and are still banned in Australia. The other thing about this refused classification is it's very broad. It also relies on this evaluation of whether material would offend a reasonable adult in the law. What is a reasonable adult? So what they have is a group of people that are picked from the community to represent community standards to choose which books should be refused classification or which websites or which films. And the question is, how do they pick these people? Do they represent what the whole of Australia wants to have happen? So the other interesting thing about refused classification is that the Australian government currently provides indirect funding for the development and maintenance of Australian websites that actually involve the detailed instruction in drug use. And this is for harm reduction purposes. So this website here is called Bluebelly. And it's a wiki-based website where people are encouraged to add to all the articles like Wikipedia. And the whole idea is to create detailed instruction in drug use, yet these sites are actually funded by the government and not currently blocked. So there's a little bit of a question mark as to whether, even if something is in law, it's not actually being enforced. I mean, another website would be the AVA website, the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League website, which contains safer injecting instructions, as you would consider this sort of information very useful for this kind of group. And again, these sorts of sites, I've had a chat with some of the people who work at ABLE, and they're very concerned that this sort of site might attract more attention under the internet filter policy. This is just a mock-up of what we might receive in the future, access denied. So how did my research fit into all this? I started this nearly 6 years ago, so a long time before the internet filter policy came about. And what I did was had a look at 40 internet forums or online bulletin boards, online forums, whichever you'd like to call them. Had a look at forums where drugs were discussed by Australians across an 18-month period. So I had a look at what sort of content these forums contain, what sorts of things they talked about, how they dealt with drug discussion in the forums. So the forums had very different ways of doing that. I then constructed an online survey to sort of see what sorts of people use these forums and get a sense of what's going on there. And then I conducted some in-depth interviews with 27 of these people who talked to me about why they preferred to talk about drugs online rather than face-to-face, and the sorts of benefits that they receive from using internet forums to discuss drugs. And they also talked about some of the harms as well. So this was a qualitatively driven and exploratory research design. And that meant that I didn't go in with sort of set assumptions or hypotheses. I just sort of went in to see what's actually happening on these forums. And in the time in 2006, there really wasn't anyone talking about drugs in relation to the internet, so it was sort of a bit new. And I think in the last couple of years, that's really started to become a little bit more mainstream in our field anyway, to start talking about internet digital technologies when it comes to drug and alcohol issues. Okay. So I'll just look at some of the data from this, and really this is just, don't need to read this one, but the folks that I found that were using drug forums were a wide range of people, but mainly around party drugs, so I didn't look specifically at entheogenic use. So the majority of people that I spoke to and surveyed were using ecstasy, cannabis, alcohol, methamphetamine. There was a little bit of hallucinogen use there, LSD, mushrooms were there. And then down the bottom of the chart there, things like research chemicals and other psychoactive plant drugs were much more, less common in the survey sample that I looked at. So one of the things that I asked was, I asked respondents if they had performed specific activities when reading or participating in online drug discussion. So what was the effect of online drug discussion for them? And two of the questions were more about harm reduction there. These two were more about benefit maximisation, or I guess trying to enjoy themselves versus reducing risk. So, I mean, really what this graph shows is that the majority of the sample said that when they were using online drug discussion, they learnt how to use drugs more safely, they learnt how to avoid bad drug experiences, but at the same time they also learnt ways to enhance drug effects, and they also found out new ways to get high. So I think on the one hand, harm reduction was a very big part of what people were doing. On the other hand, it was also about benefit maximisation, and all of this is probably not new here. What I think it shows is that there wasn't all these people going to sites and just learning how to get high. People that were learning how to get high were also learning how to do it more safely. And I thought that was an important message to put through in my thesis. With the qualitative interviews, one of the interesting things was talking to people about why they enjoyed, what they got out of talking online about drugs. And the biggest thing was accessibility. So I had sort of 4 different versions of that. I mean, the first quote here, well, I'd say the biggest advantage of being online is you can reach more people. If it's online, you're more likely to get a collective response. So being able to access a large array of people you wouldn't normally access in your everyday life through the internet forums meant that people had knowledge that was much more varied and was also more able to be questioned in a public forum. So this is the second quote which illustrates. So online you can talk to a diversity of people, from an ex-junkie to a chemist, from a drug dealer to a cook, anyone within the industry if you will. But offline you generally get to talk to some pretty ignorant people who take drugs for whatever reasons without any real knowledge of them. So one of the themes I had was that a lot of these younger people said that their friendship group was actually not so knowledgeable about drugs, whereas the internet they were able to find people that were. The other sort of idea is the sense of community, or finding people that were like you or similar to you that you could relate to. So in this quote, online forums would generally have individuals who've experienced the use of the drug firsthand and would ideally be unbiased towards any organisation's specific agendas. And Richard found that, here are people who've been through what I've been through, and they could connect with other drug users in a way that was anonymous. Okay. And I like this quote by Adam, who said, I could talk to to guys in pubs all my life, and I could still never find one person who'd used 2CB. But he could go onto online forums and he could find a whole bunch of people who'd used 2CB. And so he said that, that really helped him out. Anonymity is a huge thing, as you'd know, and there were 2 versions of that. The first here was Liam's quote, you can be anonymous to a degree, but he said, if there was a centre in the street with all this info, he wouldn't be seen walking into it. So being able to go online and get this information without showing your face was important. But also the second quote was around, I think people are more likely to ask questions online due to not feeling like they'd be embarrassed by their friends and their family. So being able to ask strangers was important as well. So I also had a chat with people about which drug practices were affected by their online drug discussion. And most commonly it was about trying new drug types, secondly around dosage, and content and purity was important, combining and mixing, knowing which drugs to do that with and not, setting of use, methods of use, preparing and extracting, and the last one was drug sourcing and access, which was much less common. And with all of these things, there were both positives and negatives. It could go either way. I think some of the people looking at my research said, well, people using the internet, they're going to try new drugs. They're all going to try new drugs. And I said, well, actually, some people said, I went online and I read a trip report and decided I'm never going to take that drug. So it worked both ways. Equally with dose, there were people who went online and said, I want to take lots of this. Let's see if I can work out how and why. Others said, I want to take less because I've read this experience that's told me that's a good idea. Content and purity, one of the biggest websites that was spoken about in my group was Pill Report. So people were using ecstasy in this group and they were very keen to find out what it contained and how pure it was. Okay. So one of the things that I found with all the public forums that I accessed was that moderation was a part of all of them. All of them were moderated by volunteers. And in some cases, the volunteers, the moderators, would aim to ensure that the content reflected a harm reduction ethos and that people could talk about drugs, but just from a harm reduction perspective. In other forums, drug discussion was not allowed at all and it would be sort of banned or blocked. No sourcing was a common thing, so in public internet forums, the moderators and administrators were aware that if it looked to the public as if they were promoting the dealing of drugs, they could get shut down. They were also keen to just keep things at a different level around harm reduction. I found that most of the dance music websites that were involved in my project tended to refer discussions onto some of the drug websites that were well respected and well known, and those included Blue Light and Erowid. But others actually went to the trouble of employing volunteers. In one case, an ambulance officer who was very knowledgeable about drugs was actually asked to have a thread in a forum just before the summer festival season, and sort of invited folks to ask their drug questions of the ambulance officer. So they really sort of got these experts in to try and look after their group. Some quotes down the bottom there from some of my respondents. If someone just wants to get high or is looking for a quick buzz, they get called out pretty quickly. So not only by the moderators, but by the folks that are part of the forum, who are really keen to just not have it all about promoting getting high, but having it about a different kind of conversation. And the second quote, it would be difficult to trust them if you didn't know who they were and there wasn't anyone else to go through what they say, like a moderator on a forum. And this guy was a young guy who did seem to really trust moderators' ability to go through the content and to sort of give it a seal of approval. And I think in the main that worked out quite well. Obviously some myths can go through that process and remain intact, but most of the time things that weren't quite right did get picked up. So the most popular drug websites that were used by my survey sample, this is just a map of those. So Pill Reports was the most popular, and Wikipedia was quite popular as a drug website used by everyone. Other harm reduction drug websites, this included Erowid and Blue Light, and Google. Google was very important. So down the bottom there are the things that you probably wouldn't use, like the government websites, things like social media, that kind of thing, weren't very well trusted by this group. So, you'd be aware of some of these sites already. Pill Reports contains information about the content and purity of pills sold as ecstasy, but it also has stories about what people have done, that's sort of in the comments, that kind of thing. And I think that thing could be classified as instructional potentially. So I think Pill Reports could quite possibly be banned under an internet filter. Equally, I think Erowid could quite possibly be banned under an internet filter the way that it's currently defined, simply because Erowid and Blue Light both contain instructional material developed by drug users for drug users, and personal narratives dealing with drug experiences. And even though these are designed to assist and educate drug users, they could indeed fall under this category. Wikipedia does have a lot of detailed information about drugs, and if you do, I just did a Google search here on JWH, and you know, obviously Google is the gateway to all of these sites and many more, but I doubt that Google and Wikipedia will be blocked by the internet filter. I imagine that there will be some sites that do a lot, like say YouTube, they've already got their own sort of self-censorship in a way, so that sort of gets them out of this problem of being filtered. Having gone through that, what is actually happening with the internet filter? I'm just sort of starting into 2011 rather than going back to the history of its development. And in 2011 we found out that the Australian Law Reform Commission was going to do a complete review of the media classification system in this country. So that was an exciting thing, and that started then. And then in May, a couple of months later, they released an issues paper where they talked about a number of things. This was only one part of a very large review that they've been doing on a number of other issues. One of those issues was, what is the definition of refused classification? Should it stay the same? Is it a good definition for current purposes, especially given that media has changed so much in the last 10 to 20 years? The landscape is so very different to how it was perhaps when they first put this together. So we had a couple of months, and in July they received public submissions. There were over 1,000 submissions from concerned citizens as well as organisations that were interested in inputting around this issue. So I wrote up a submission on behalf of the National Drug Research Institute, basically presenting this information I presented today and saying that there could be some quite serious health consequences, negative consequences, if some of these websites were blocked in the future for people who use drugs. And around that time as well, in a separate move, the major ISPs in Australia, Telstra and a couple of others, voluntarily began to filter child pornography websites from a list supplied by Interpol. So that sort of happened while this process was going on, and I think is still happening at the moment. So in September, the ALRC released their response to the submissions, and I was really happy to see that they cited our work around drugs. And also Google was the other corporation submission that spoke about drugs, and they pretty much backed up what we said, which was great to hear. So what the ALRC recommended was that refused classification be narrowed. So from the broad definition, including a very large number of things around sexual stuff that they thought was alternative, leading also to drugs and terrorism and euthanasia and all those sorts of things. And they felt that it should just include actual sexual abuse of children and depictions of actual sexual violence. So that was what they recommended in their most recent report. However, the final report is not due to the government until the beginning of next year. And the question is, what will happen after that? So the federal government has said that once that report is tabled, then they will go ahead with the internet filter, with its recommendations. We don't know exactly how they're going to respond. So I'd urge you to check out the website for the Australian Law Reform Commission and actually follow this project so you can see the final report in January. It's worth doing, as I think it'll be an interesting read. So what will happen if these sites are blocked? I know we can't predict the future, but I guess for me, having looked at how people use these sites through my research, my concern is that, firstly, I mean, there's two things. One is that the filter can be bypassed using a number of technical solutions to that. So that's one part of it. For many people who are technically savvy, this is going to be bypassed. For the other part is that not everybody's going to have that technical knowledge at their hands. Not everyone's going to do that. And for example, someone who had perhaps never used a drug but were interested in trying it and didn't know about any of this stuff, and they went to Google and they put in that drug name, what sorts of sites are they going to get? Are they going to get some of the sites that are blocked? What sort of information is going to come up for them? So even though people that are experts can perhaps bypass the filter, what's going to happen to the novices who are looking? So my concern is that a lot of this information is going to move from the public domain to the private domain, and that means it'll move from a regulated to an unregulated environment. Potential consequences of that, as far as I'm concerned, is increased harms for people who may be less educated about particular drugs that they can't find information about. And also that your researchers and many other different bodies are monitoring this information that's publicly available online at the moment, and that means we can be more quick to respond. Although I do note there that one of the problems with that is that also law enforcement are also watching us in public forums, so they are also more quick to respond. So there could be some advantages in a way of going private. And one of the things that I've been trying to do, as Martin mentioned in the intro, is to sort of connect people who use drugs with the people who are making policy. And I'm not to say that they're not always separate, sometimes they're not separate, but to engage in more between those two entities, to have a dialogue. So that's something that I'd like to engage in. And I think when you have drug users talking publicly in an anonymous setting online, you have the potential to actually come on and say, you know, let's talk openly about this. I've done that in a couple of forums, and I've just actually entered into the Oz Stoners forum, which is a new realm for me, and come up and said, hey, this is who I am. Do you guys want to talk about some of the issues around cannabis and law reform? And I can tell you what we're doing in the research realm, and we can sort of talk further. And what they've said is, that's great. We'll do it on the forum because we can remain anonymous and we can have this dialogue. But we don't want to come along to some session where, you guys might take our names down, or we might have to sort of show our faces. So I think it is a problem if that doesn't happen. Okay, so the final part of my talk is about the growth in hidden internet services, and I guess this is just my way of seeing how the internet's changed over the last 20 years from what you would say started off as a fairly unregulated frontier, where there were much fewer internet users, and more of this stuff could be said. Even though the internet was public, not so many people were using it enough to have it the way it is at the moment. I think in the mid-2000s, coming into today, there became a critical mass of internet users, and now we're in a position where someone puts something up on Twitter and the next day they can be fired. Someone sort of misspeaks in an online way, and there are major consequences for that they didn't used to be. So I think what we might be finding is a backlash towards hidden internet services. So this is just a quote from one of the moderators of one of the forums in my thesis. He said, if you go back to some of the really early discussion, it was basically a small group of people who all partied together. People spoke quite openly about drug use, but that's changed over time, as what was essentially a hobby website has grown to become an international resource and a commercial enterprise. So that's sort of charting the change from, say, the mid-1990s through to, say, the mid-2000s for this particular website. Okay, so congratulations, you are using Tor. So Tor, as I'll talk about, is I'm not a technical person here, so I'll probably get this a little bit wrong. But Tor is a client that you can download that enables you to mask your IP address through basically piping your internet stream through a bunch of different other computers, so that the exit node is a completely different computer. And what that means is that the IP address down the bottom of this thing here is something completely different to me. So if I were in China and I wanted to access websites that were behind the Chinese firewall and I had Tor, I would be able to bypass by going through, say, an American or a German or some other country's web, so that I could access those websites. And this is available free and it's open source. So this is the website Silk Road, which is available only through Tor. And this is a hidden internet service, so it's an example of what I've been talking about. And Silk Road is actually a little bit like an eBay for drugs. So it has lots of different drug categories. This is just an example of the cannabis category. And as you can see, there's a name, a price, a seller, the country it ships from, and you can add it to your cart. So how do these people pay for their drugs in this website? They use the encrypted currency Bitcoin. And this currency is something that's been it's been around for a couple of years now. It's being used for many different purposes by, say, folks that are libertarian persuasion that just want to have a completely different currency and not go through the standard methods of paying for things. Bitcoin, I should just explain this here. So this is LSD, as you can see. But what I loved about this was that this is basically a dealer's pitch here. You know, acid, very potent, very fun. You know, twice the normal dose. It says budding psychonauts should be very careful. Happy tripping, Lysander. And at the bottom there's a feedback system here. So Lysander's got 5 out of 5 for the last 15 transactions. So you can then look at the seller and have a little look at more about what they do and the other things that they sell. So you can see here that there were 211 transactions, 99.6% positive feedback. And at the bottom here you can see the PGP key. So these guys are very into encryption, and this goes through everything that they do. And the PGP key enables you as the buyer to send your address to the seller encrypted so that only they can read it, so that if someone was to intercept that traffic, they would not be able to get that piece of information, which is vital obviously to receive the package, but also obviously you don't want that to be connected with the purchase. There's also other goods here, as you can see. Mainly it's drugs, but there are some other types of goods. Home and garden, forgeries, drug paraphernalia, that kind of thing. So with the Bitcoins, you can buy them through an exchange, so you can go to a number of different websites and buy them that way, or you can also mine for Bitcoins. So if you have a computer with a high processing power, you can actually mine for Bitcoins. I don't know the technical details, there's probably some more people that do here as to how you can do that. It's sort of a whole monetary system that's set up. It's a peer-to-peer monetary system as well, so it really just involves, there's no central place where this is happening that can be shut down. Like peer-to-peer software, it's very difficult to actually shut this down. So there is a wiki for Silk Road once you're in there, and this is sort of where do I start, the 10 points on what you need to do. And you know, there are barriers of entry there. I think for most of us, certainly I found that I was able to install the Tor client, but I haven't actually got to the process where I've gone and bought Bitcoins and gone through all this stuff. There's a lot of different things you have to consider in terms of your own security, in terms of how to use PGP. So this is a major barrier for, I think, the majority of the population. However, you don't need the majority of the population to be using this sort of site for it to really change the drug markets, I think. Really, if 1 or 2 out of 100 people were ordering the sorts of drugs that are available here and getting them into, say, Australia, then I think there would be a change in the purity and availability of some of the things that we receive here. I was looking through the FAQ and there was a question, you know, hi, I'm Australian, how do I buy Bitcoins? So there's definitely a lot of interest in the Australian market in this international site. And these are some of the places that Australians can get Bitcoins, and there's an exchange rate there. So they also have forums, which are quite active. And the forums, just I'll tell you about escrow. So you're probably wondering, who pays first when you're buying a drug online? And in this case, there's actually an escrow, so a place where the money is held. Once you pay, it gets held there until the buyer says, actually, yes, I have received the package. So as a result, sellers won't sell to new buyers, because new buyers might actually say the package hasn't arrived when it has. So buyers have to get a certain amount of trust as well as sellers before using this system. So this is the forums. They have forums on drug safety, shipping, security. There's also product requests and product offers. So I find that quite interesting that you could basically say, is there any interest in this particularly new compound? Will people buy it from me if I put it up as a dealer? If there's interest, then you could put it up. And again, all this stuff is available through using the Tor system only. So none of this is in the public web, and that's very important in terms of the internet filter. So there's just a bit of an example of the harm reduction stuff that's available here. It's a thread MDMA versus cocaine, cocaine versus morphine, strained heart caused by JWH, trying mescaline, advice. So I don't know to the extent that this is moderated, and this wasn't certainly something that I looked at through my research, which is around public internet forums. So the shipping is something that people have asked about, and there's a thread there on Australian shipping, people that were really concerned about how long they could expect a package to take if they ordered it from the Netherlands or from the EU. And certainly a lot of people talk about their concerns around customs essentially in this country. But on that note, a lot of people, a lot of Australians have had success with this website. So even though customs will say, yes, we have all these devices and we screen everything, certainly some packages are getting through. Yes, so I might just move on if I can. Whoop. So Silk Road is not the only one of these sites. I had a look at some of the others on the hidden web, and one of them is called Black Market. It's very similar to Silk Road. So here, this is the NBOME, which is sort of similar to LSD according to this description. The other thing that I found on Black Market, unfortunately, was hitmen services. So there are some other things that are available that, yeah, it's questionable. I don't know whether it's a joke or real, but they do have it on there, and it is 4,000 bitcoins, half up first and half later, and yeah. Order DMT anonymously. There's a DMT website on the hidden web. Research chemical website, UK Ganja, Open Onion Weed Shop. So there's lots of different sites, they've all popped up, and I mean the hidden web's been around for a while, but in terms of the drug, in terms of all of this technology confluencing together, it's really only happened in 2011. So this is sort of something that's happened over the last, Silk Road came out in February. So in terms of where to from here, I mean, for me, we'll continue monitoring the progress of the internet filter policy, and especially it'll be really exciting if we get to the point where the final report says, look, refused classification is way too broad, and this is not just about the internet, this is about books, films, video games, any kind of media content. And for that to be changed so that refused classification no longer includes detailed instruction in drug use would be a real win, I think, for ensuring free information that we all think should be out there. And the concern is that this isn't just in Australia. There are lots of other countries where we know that there is internet filtering. In China, as what I mentioned earlier. But we've just heard from the USA, the Stop Online Privacy Act, which, although it's dealing with pirated DVDs, etc., pirated content, and downloading that. Because some people use Tor to anonymise them when they're doing this, they're attacking Tor as well, which is part of this issue. So it'll be interesting to see whether the Stop Online Privacy Act actually goes through, as it may really reduce the freedom in the US of internet policy, which is of internet content, which is really quite incredible to me. I think we need to keep honest drug information in the public realm. I think that one of the ways to do that is to show that there are some real advantages to using the existing drug websites, because they have systems within them for moderation. If you have a whole new drug website, it's much harder to build up those systems with those volunteers that are able to do that moderation, which is so important. And finally, to look at hidden tool services. And I mean, for me, I think it really might challenge prohibition in and of itself. If this continues, if there's no way of shutting down a site like Silk Road, and so far it doesn't seem to be, if that continues and that grows, will we be in a position where prohibition will just seem completely ludicrous? So I wonder about that. Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone who has helped me with this speech, and especially all the participants in all the forums, and especially Blue Light, as they put in a lot for me, and my supervisors, and all of my family and friends who've endured my PhD for the last 6 years, so to thank those too. Thanks. I've just got my contact details up there, And feel free to come introduce yourself, because we're not all on the internet right this very moment, but later on you can follow me on Twitter at Monica Barrett and on my blog. And we've also got a study going on at the moment on synthetic cannabinoids at chronicstudy.net. I've got a few little cards floating around the place here. Very different topic to this, but we're very interested in the legal situation around synthetic cannabinoids, so I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that at a later date too. Cool.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thanks, Monica.
Thanks.